Alright, today we're going to be discussing off-tanking, and I'm going to give you a few rules to follow to be a successful off-tank and to help out your raid the most that you possibly can in that position. The first rule that I'd like to highlight is that flexibility is key. Your job is essentially to be a flexible position, damage when there's no need for an extra tank, pick up adds. You're the one that should be chasing the adds that pull off the main tank and run towards the healers, if that were to ever occur. You always want to be ready to have the boss on you at a moment's notice if the main tank goes down, which of course means that you should always attempt to be second and third if you're the second off tank, second and third on threat, so that if that main tank does go down for whatever reason, that there's no need to rely on a taunt. The boss is coming straight to you, and you should be ready in an instant to transition to being the main tank for the rest of the fight and assuming those responsibilities. You should have the right gear pre-equipped for situations in advance, knowing what those situations are by having proper knowledge of all fights and encounters, as well as preparing those flexible gear sets in advance, those being threat, mitigation, etc., etc. Another rule that I would recommend living by is that you need to match the intensity of your DPS. This is a bit of a different game than it was 15 years ago. DPS have figured out the game and they know how to maximize their output very well through the use of things like consumables, world buffs, optimized rotations, optimized specs, proper use of cooldowns, etc., etc. You need to also be doing that. You need to match their intensity. The tricky thing is that the DPS have clear metrics to measure their success week to week and a bar to shoot for every single time, because there are things called logs where they can check their parses, both in relation to past week's performance, the rest of the raid members in their guild, as well as everyone else in the Warcraft community that's raiding and is running logs. So there's a very competitive nature to this, and it drives them to maximize their performance. As a tank, you don't get the same, the convenience of having such a clear bar, where it's all about maximizing damage output, but it's a more ethereal concept like threat, which can be a little harder to manage. The parses are a little muddier. You're not checking threat parses, you're checking DPS parses, so it's just a little messier to keep up with. But you need to have the same intensity in spite of that, which means you're getting all the consumables. Whatever world buffs your raid has, you're there, you're getting them too. You've optimized your rotation and you're using your cooldowns effectively to build a large threat lead that your DPS cannot catch. Even warriors popping all their cooldowns during execute phase, and you will be shocked at how quickly they will double their base threat when they have Death Wish, Diamond Flask, Recklessness, etc. pop at the end of the fight. You'll be shocked how quickly that threat spikes. So one thing that I really would like to highlight here is that when you're matching your DPS's intensity, never ever get complacent and never ever assume that you're far enough ahead on threat. Worst case scenario, you were and nothing bad happened, but if you're not far enough ahead and your guild is trying to progress and speed up clear times, the worst thing in the world is if your DPS have to start skipping global cooldowns because they're afraid they're going to pass you on threat, and this happens a lot. Particularly if people are stuck in their ways and fixated on maintaining full mitigation gear, running only tier set stuff. They're afraid to dual wield, pop cooldowns, etc. Like, in those scenarios, you're gonna watch yourself fall behind if you have some top tier DPS in your guild. At the very least, for consumables, every week, every time, you should be running elemental sharpening stones, mongoose, elixir, and a strength buff, either the juju from Winter Spring or elixir of giants. In my opinion, these are just the absolute baseline that you should be running pretty much at all times. The Sharpstone and Mongoose alone provide over 5% crit, and especially if you are what I consider the optimal off-tank spec of Fury Prot, That improves your flurry uptime significantly, it improves your threat output and rage generation significantly, and all these add up to really improve your ability to off-tank effectively. The next rule to live by, I guess rule 3 now, is that you need to be ready to do chain pulls. So as a tanking core, when one pack is dying, you should have the next tank, one of the off-tanks, moving and pulling so that you can essentially smooth out the raid into what feels like one long giant encounter all the way up to a boss finale, essentially. Unless your healers are running out of mana or they're falling way behind on healing people, you should just be going pack to pack to pack to pack with no downtime. You can watch if there's 30 to 40 pulls in a raid. Every single time a pack dies and people are then identifying their next targets. Healers are drinking, people are kind of dirtling around for 10 to 15 seconds while the mobs get the gunshot at them, their travel time to the raid. All that is lost time, and you do that 30-40 times across an entire Molten Core run, for example, you're losing a ton of time across the entire duration of that raid. So that's one thing you can do to really speed up your guild's progression, is chain pulling and making sure you're communicating, even if you're just saying pulling, as one pack dies, getting the next one engaged and traveling to eliminate all that downtime, so your DPS are just pack to pack to pack shredding, and they never have to stop. One of your off-tanks should definitely be designated to, or everybody, if you can just maintain a high level of awareness, but you should always be checking your healer's mana and, announcing little breaks as you progress through the dungeon to get healers caught up. But as soon as that healer breaks combat and sits to drink, you should then be moving to pull the next pack, because they can continue drinking until they choose to stand up and start casting again. So once they've started drinking to restore their mana, you don't then need to wait until they're at full mana. In fact, you've done something wrong if you're waiting all the way until all healers are at full mana to start moving to then pull. You've wasted time again. As soon as they sit down to drink, unless they're all totally depleted, you're moving. You're moving, you're pulling, because as the mobs are running to you and you start taking damage, they get several ticks of mana restoration in, and they can always get free water from mages, and your mages are going to love that. Next rule to live by: be vocal but concise. So you don't want to be clogging up comms, especially if you're not a raid leader, but you want to be announcing things like 1 or 2 words to announce that you're pulling the next pack, so that people are prepared for it. Announce cooldowns when you use them. Say Death Wish, you're going to be taking more damage, healers should know that so they can account for it. Announce what you're doing with your other tanks so that y'all can work around each other more effectively and be more of a dynamic single unit, instead of a bunch of individuals trying to figure out what each other's doing, or all relying on one person to pull and do all the work, being your main tank, and everybody else just kind of DPSing until you have to tank some adds. All of you should just be rotating around each other and communicating with each other so that you can make the run as smooth and seamless as possible. This is a sort of difficult one to explain, but the next rule is to pad boss swaps, is what I've called it. One thing that can be challenging is when the main tank dies and you are doing your job properly, you're second on threat, the boss swaps to you. You have to wait on, occasionally, the healer's reaction times to realize that the boss is on you. You can mitigate this by announcing it, by the way, being vocal but concise, the last rule. But once you've announced that you're tanking, you still have to wait on cast bars and reaction times. In that moment, especially if you see the writing on the wall and you can see that main tank is going down, using those initial globals to do things like popping Greater Stone Shield Potion, popping Last Stand, making sure that you have that shield on, even Shield Wall if necessary, to make sure that you give them time to catch up, because it seems like, at least for my guild, If an off tank is going to die after the main tank dies, 80% of the time it's going to be almost immediately, because the healers didn't transition quick enough, or their cast didn't finish, or the off tank was not prepared for that spike damage that was incoming. One tip for this too, that I do, that I would recommend, is have in a single macro swapping to defensive stance, which as an off tank you should already be in it, but there's no cost to doing it. But to that you also want to macro your shield equip and your shield block, so that in a single global you can throw a shield on, swap to defensive stance if you for some reason weren't, and cast shield block to avoid getting crit or crushed while your healers transition. So if you were off tanking, dual wielding as you should have been, because if you don't have something actively attacking you, you should be dual wielding. It will increase your threat output, rage generation, and damage, all significantly. There's no reason not to be. But boom, okay, the main tank dies, the boss is now on you. You should be in a single global equipping the shield and casting shield block to mitigate the next swing that could crit and pummel you into the ground before your healers are ready to transition to you. So that's a helpful macro that I like to use. Consider using it yourself. As an off tank, in my opinion, your rotation really doesn't change much from a main tank. Your big money spell is going to be Bloodthirst or Shield Slam, depending on your spec. That's your big rage and big threat ability. Revenge should also be used on cooldown. So both of these should always be used on cooldown whenever possible. Heroic Strike spamming, if you've watched my previous video or you've seen some of the high-end rating, spamming Heroic Strike alongside keeping these abilities on cooldown is the highest threat per second you can do. However, unless you are main tanking or you're in a scenario where you just have unlimited rage, you can't dump your rage fast enough, spamming Heroic Strike can be a trap, because the rage cost is much higher than it appears, because it replaces your next auto attack, which means it's costing you the next auto, whereas things like Revenge and Bloodthirst are not. Which, using an ability independent of your auto attacks, like Bloodthirst or Revenge, gives you a second opportunity to crit, maintain your flurry uptime. Looks like the recording ended, but I'll just quick finish here. And therefore it is just objectively worse to start spamming Heroic Strike unless Bloodthirst, Shield Slam, and Revenge are already on cooldown. So if you have any other questions, let me know. The only other thing that I could think to really offer you as an off tank is to coordinate with your other tanks to ensure that all necessary warrior or druid debuffs are up on the target at all times. You want to have Demo Shout on harder progression fights, maybe Thunderclap. You want somebody maintaining Sunders. You might designate that to one person, whereas everybody else is maximizing their threat output. That person can rotate if you want. You can have a dedicated person. However, one thing that I would not recommend at this time, based on my guild's testing, shout out to Smeet for that, a paladin in our guild that tested this, Nightfall doesn't seem to be worth it, at least at this time. The uptime is pretty horrible, and so we haven't really bothered with it. It would cost us more than it would benefit us, it seems, from the math that we've done. You make your own choice, but we don't bother with Nightfall debuff, but you would want to coordinate with the other tanks to maintain the other important ones. So any questions, leave a comment or reach out to me directly, and thanks for watching.